We have around 20 minutes now, 25 minutes for some Q&A, and there'll be a microphone coming round. So pop your hands up and I'll take any questions. Although I might just lead with one if I can while I'm hogging the mic, which is to Julia. First point, really struck by the final thing you said around biodiversity policy only really works if you can snap those kind of decisions to a plan that sits above them, that actually sets out the vision for what a place is trying to achieve and does so in a kind of democratic way that takes people's views and perceptions and everything into account. I was really also struck by the fascinating point about that you have to value cultural affinity to particular natural assets, not just the ecological value of them. Is there any way in which a metric can fully capture and then help you perhaps trade off between cultural and ecological value, or is that always going to be a kind of more of a professional kind of qualitative judgment, do you think?
This is on. It's a really interesting question. Part of me wants to hold back in terms of emphasizing too much on metrics, because then it comes a numbers game and you lose the sense of what's actually going on. I'm really excited about Natural England's revision to DEFRA's metric. I think it's much better. They're including various things like, from the ecological point of view, like ecological spatial connection and connectivity and things like that. So that's great, and that's certainly a good addition. In terms of people's aspects of biodiversity, we've been looking at a well-being assessment, and there's some really interesting methods coming out about assessing people's well-being. But I think even though you still need to step back, and it's that combination of qualitative stuff with a number, and I do love numbers. There's a part of me that loves a good graph, but I also need to step back and think you need the bigger picture to make sense of it.
Can I just add to that as well? I think for policy as well, it's going to be really difficult to translate all those contested shared values that people might have about this issue, but that's no reason not to have a policy base. And it seems to me that we are missing some areas of planning policy that deal with these more woolly and shades of grey area. It's great to see the planners are now starting to go into that, because they recognise that we've got to go beyond simply just land use considerations. And so I just think that's an important element. You need metrics, you need policy, and you also then need the evaluation to measure the progress.
All right, yes.
Actually, my question was going to be pretty much the same, but after you've put it as well, I'll slightly modify it. I was also going to ask Julia about this whole thing about green space, which I suppose is a subset of the sort of cultural type thing, in that the metrics are very useful and it's really sort of flagging up the value of biodiversity. But we have got this very important situation, especially in dense urban areas where loss of green space is really critical. So just thinking off the hoof, because you've already sort of answered that question, do you think, and this throws it open maybe to all of you as well, do you think there's other sort of policy mechanisms which might assist in that? For example, the idea of neighbourhood plans getting a bit of sort of greater weight in terms of policy. Do you think that's maybe going to be the sort of Trojan horse which will enable us to sort of safeguard green space in sort of the absence of, let's say, hard biodiversity value?
Well, very quickly then, I'd say I don't like looking at the word green space as if it for one particular benefit. I think one thing that's really important is if you start thinking about the multifunctional nature of those green spaces and what are the priorities in that area. And the evidence base will then lead to good local plan policies that might favour, say, air pollution management, which then means that the green space collectively in that street, in that neighbourhood, whatever, is used for that, but equally recognising the other multifunctional benefits that could be built into that as well, such as places for recreation. So this is where I get a little bit tetchy with green space and green infrastructure, because I see green space by itself as not being particularly important. But green space becomes important when it is used to deliver multifunctional benefits within a green infrastructure network at a variety of scales.
But yeah, just to add to that, I think it's part of the last point as well in terms of making a contribution. it's really important to link biodiversity net gain to a local plan or a local policy and really look at everything within that local policy. About it might be green infrastructure, or some local authorities have talked about coverage of the amount of habitats that they want in a city. Because it's very tricky in very dense urban areas to achieve net gain if you're taking away habitat with creating new habitat elsewhere in terms of the coverage. So it's definitely the more safeguards that we can give to making sure that we don't see these projects waving a net gain flag, but then they've lost green space. And I think our job within industries is to be very transparent about what we're actually doing with that as well.
I think in terms of strategic planning, and I think it's quite important to use the strategic planning of green infrastructure, whether it's related to all types of green infrastructure, especially to tree, as a means to engage with the local communities and get communities' input. At the moment, there's often those strategies, they're often the remit of experts. And that's absolutely needed. The experts are the ones who I think are able to probably guide and structure and take it to the level of thoroughness it needs to be taken to. But what is often missing from green infrastructure strategy as they are used at the moment and produced at the moment are that level of engagement at the local level and the link with the neighborhood plans or the local plans. That's really lacking. It's not necessarily the case in other countries. I can definitely think about not green infrastructure strategies, but cities that have taken a strategic approach to the management of their tree population, that do a master plan for how they're going to manage all of the trees, whether they're in the public realm or the private realm, in terms of managing their ability to protect some privately owned trees, and that consult on that. And it can help avoid situations like the ones we have in Sheffield at the moment, where there's no engagement at all, or only engagement once we're at the point of felling or of making drastic changes. So having the opportunities to have public input, one, strategic decisions are made from a planning perspective, and getting the public more involved in green infrastructure planning, open space planning, however you want to call it, and whatever the focus of the strategy is, I think there's a real need for that. It's quite tricky to do in the resource-poor environment that we're in at the moment. But in terms of integration and in terms of accountability to taxpayers and local residents and people who actually use the infrastructures, those assets, I don't see any other ways to do it.
There's a question from the gentleman in the pink shirt.
Thank you. Lilac, please, not pink. The question of scale has just been mentioned. I was just thinking about how these ambitions can be undermined over time by the whole kind of viability issues that developers claim, and how, given that trees take a long time to come to maturity and to deliver their benefits more in the longer run, how that can be secured. Even though local plans have 20, 30-year time periods, they get reviewed every 3, 4, 5 years these days because of the housing numbers. Was there any advice about reconciling those challenges?
Well, in terms of, I think there's one element of metrics that's really interesting to work with is canopy cover as something that gets monitored and is including in the annual monitoring report and the monitoring metrics that are used for a local plan, but also in terms of how does one consider if there's trade-offs that are going to be done for a given site, looking at no net canopy loss. If that's supported by local planning policies, that can be a means to ensure that if there's mitigation that's going to be done, there's a better chance that there's less of a loss. So where the developers is asked to mitigate for the canopy coverage that was on site before development, and provide that either in fee so that the trees can be planted elsewhere, but that the trees that are being planted, say, within 5 or 10 years, either immediately or within a reasonable time frame, can rebuild the canopy cover so that you don't have to wait 30, 40 years, so that there's enough trees that are planted right away, so that within 5 years, This is something High Wycombe District Council is trying to implement at the moment, to have a canopy cover target for the whole of the borough, but also a set of targets that's applied to individual development sites. And in order for planners to make the decision on whether the planting provisions, say if you're going to have some loss, are appropriate, they have actually an assessment matrix that's based on the soil volume and growth curves, because we know how fast it takes to a tree for the range of species that are planted in the urban environment. We know how quickly a tree gets to a certain size. So if the tree is given an appropriate soil volume, if it's planted correctly, it will get to that size. So there's means to build in predictability and to model whether a planting proposal will actually provide canopy replacement or not. It might not be replacement, it might just be pure increase, which is part of what High Wycombe is trying to do. So there are technical ways to optimize the system and to, I think, get to the types of outcomes you're describing, I think.
So it was about securing long-term outcomes, essentially. So I mean, as Balfour Beatty, what we'd like to see with our clients when we're bidding for major infrastructure projects at the moment is a question on how we're going to deliver net gain over 25, 30 years. Biodiversity net gain in the country at the moment is voluntary. You know, it's with the big players. And yes, there's an exciting mandatory consultation by DEFRA at the moment. Should we make it mandatory? But essentially, it's to do with the commissioning agency and the funder, as well as we have our role to play being a contractor in terms of pushing this. You know, if you're telling us to do biodiversity net gain, it's got to be secured for that long time frame and have it right there in the project, because then we'll price for it. It will be within our target price. And my company are very good at finding ways of limiting liability. So they'll want it off their books, which means, to me, in the hands of someone who's actually good. It won't be us. You know, it'll be like a local wildlife group, where it should be, and just making sure they're adequately funded. But it's right at the start to stipulate it, right at the start of the development. The other thing, just quickly, is that we need to get very strict on our communication. Now, whenever I start with biodiversity net gain, I always get project managers saying to me, oh, when can we claim it? You know, when can we have that case study? You cannot claim biodiversity net gain until you've got monitoring data 20, 30, 40 years down the line of actually delivering it. Until then, you are predicting a biodiversity net gain outcome. So as an industry, as a community, we need to get much better in our language when we talk about this to make the point, and developers will go, oh, right, okay, we need to do this, this, and this. So I think there's a couple of things there.
One final thing to add is beware the paper tiger syndrome. One of the Cinderellas of the planning system at the moment is enforcement. Very, very limited enforcement officers for each county. You're lucky if you've got more than one. So it's great having all of this in place, but it's going to be useless if you haven't then got the monitoring elements that can lead then to interventions to actually prevent net gain being falsely claimed and not actually achieved later down the line. So one of the key issues is making sure that you do have that enforcement function, which is properly resourced.
Got a question here in the guy in the blue shirt.
I'm an arborist, so I value trees, but there are lots of valuation systems for trees, CAVAT, iTree, and so on and so forth, which makes it relatively easy to include them in natural capital accounting. But there are other habitats which are just as or more valuable in terms of biodiversity, chalk grassland, heathland, wetlands, and so on. There's very little, as far as I know, metrics for actually valuing them in the same sorts of terms. So they have to be qualitative. Would you agree with that? There's no room for, at the moment, for any kind of quantitative valuation. Was I not speaking loud enough? Sorry. Did you get any of that?
Yeah, I think it was. Do you want to take that one?
I'm really sorry, I couldn't hear the question. Yes, if you wouldn't mind just speaking a little more in the microphone. Thank you.
So sorry. There are lots of systems for valuing trees. CAVAT, iTree, Heliwell, so on and so forth. But very few for habitats which are of equal or more value, chalk grassland, heathland, wetlands and so on. So those valuations have to be qualitative, much harder in some respects to include them in the sorts of metrics which you are speaking of as being of use to planning policy and so on and so forth. Is that the only way it can be done? Are there any ways that you know of providing the same kind of quantitative evaluations of those habitats?
I think part of that is looking at the natural capital community. There are a lot of natural capital accounts are frustratingly at the national policy level, so they're not in my world when I've got railway or road or whatever, looking at that little patch of grassland. But we've been working with the Natural Capital Coalition on more project level accounting, and especially with FTech, who are a brilliant firm, looking at how do you generate the metrics in terms of the value of that. There's, as always with any kind of metrics, there's advantages and disadvantages. The advantages is there are some aspects of natural capital accounting that give you monetary value, and that speaks the language of business. But there are some aspects of it that doesn't capture the full range of values, like iTree or something like that. So I think it's a really interesting question, and I think there's a lot more work to be done in that area. But natural capital accounting is one way at the moment.
Can I just add, in my NERC knowledge exchange role, I have a particular remit to publicise Natural Environment Research Council research. So one of the key issues I've found in the whole plethora of projects out there that are funded by the research councils is that very few of them necessarily permeate all the public and professional domains. So there is a big gap, and therefore the question that you raise is there is lots of particular research projects going on particular aspects, but nobody's actually really joining these together. And therefore this is one of the big challenges where the research community needs to work much more effectively with the professional and practice communities to actually share the best intelligence of which tools are fit for which purpose. Because at the moment, a lot of research projects are creating their own new tool, which may not necessarily be the best approach, because there could be existing tools that could be enhanced. So I do think sometimes we get a little bit too wrapped into that, and particularly the quantitative metrics, as if, and not to take issue with what Julia is saying, they are crucial, but we need to have metrics that cover the quantitative and the qualitative that work collaboratively together. And I don't see enough research drawing that together, but there are some big projects, such as I1 are in the audience, which is an initiative that's looking at Sheffield, an initiative that's looking at Manchester, which is trying to join together the different research strands to build exactly what you're talking about. And they do have their own websites, but there's the issue.
One place to look at right now to have a sense of some of the tools that are available is the Ecosystems Knowledge Network's website that provides an overview of a wide range of valuation tools that are available. Some provides only qualitative outputs, some provide statistics on the quantums, and some provide monetization covering a wide range of assets, not just trees. iTree Eco is in there, CAVAT is in there, but you also have something like the Natural Capital Planning Tool, which is a tool that can take in a lot of different habitats, but then only looks at, is it improving or is it being degraded? And you have local planning authority using that. So you have a range of tools that are out there, and the ecosystem knowledge networks provide a description of what they do, how they were developed. So that's one place to look at.
We've got time for maybe one more question, if anyone. Yes, just at the back.
Sorry, I was just thinking of a triple metric to measure both the green infrastructure, the people, the biodiversity, quantitatively, but then also mirror that with a quality assessment as well, and that the decisions need to be made in terms of pretty much those 6 factors, unless you can think of another 2 factors to add to it.
I think it's a really interesting concept, and it just highlights we're still getting there. and just how important it is at the moment not to make a decision based on a single number. You know, we've got DEFRA's metric, Natural England are updating it, but great. But we still need to advance the metrics, but also Alister just made a really good point. Within industry, we are flooded with tools all the time. You know, it's just like, yeah, another tool, my God. You know, can we just have one thing that does the job? You know, and I've been insanely jealous of my colleagues in sustainability teams who have a carbon calculator and that's it. You know, and then they can produce their fancy graphs, the board members and stuff. So I think it's a really exciting time, and I think it would be really great to see that. But I think we can never get away from that combination of the qualitative and the quantitative, and we need to get better in terms of case studies about that, and making sure that whenever there is that word professional judgment, that it's verified and audited by an independent body.
Yeah, so maybe to add to that, it's making decisions that are transparent and that actually can be traced back to the evidence. So these metrics and all these tools are used as decision support. But what we mustn't fall into the trap of is having almost policy-based evidence where you decide what you're going to do and then you cherry pick all the different bits of stuff out there that then can justify that particular approach. And I think, if I can be candid, well, how can I be candid here? I think we are falling very much into that area in the current way that a lot of decisions are being made, that people actually have a particular policy they want to go down and then they try and find the evidence to support it, rather than pull back in the way that we've been talking about. And just to say, biodiversity net gain and the trees, I think these talks may have seemed very diverse, but they connect across, because I see green infrastructure as a kind of a glue that can help connect these multiple benefits together. And I think that's its greatest strength and potentially greatest weakness in the silo world that we live. So I think that's why we do need to have metrics that work across the silos as well. Otherwise, we run the risk of focusing too much on one particular metric in one particular silo.
That seems like a good enough place to end it, I think. So thank you very much for being such an attentive and engaged audience. And if we could just give a final round of applause to our speakers.